75 years ago, this weekend marked the end of the Second World War in Europe, a momentous occasion in the history of our nation and in the history of our college, and one that marks a significant loss of life for Dunstanians who went off to fight for our country and for its freedom from tyranny. And I'm really delighted that our chaplain has agreed to reflect on this today, and I hope that you will listen to his sage words as this momentous occasion resonates so much with the challenge that we currently face today. So 75 years ago marked the end of the Second World War in Europe, and it also marked the end of an extraordinarily tough chapter in the history of St Dunstan's. And I've done a little more reading on this chapter in our history since I last spoke with you, and I can confirm that 6 years before VE Day, at 8 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, the 2nd of September 1939, 393 people gathered outside St Dunstan's College. Mostly it was children returning from their long summer holiday break, but there were also, of course, as would be today, many new children who were starting their first term at St Dunstan's, and they all gathered at the front along with teachers and their wives and their families. And in all, there were 22 groups that were formed up, and they were positioned at regular intervals from St Dunstan's College all the way down to the train station at Forest Hill. And they were accompanied by luggage, gas masks, innumerable labels and forms. And in the history books, it says that no one fainted as they were waiting for it. It was a glorious morning. No one fainted as they waited for their instruction, although one boy was sick and prefects had to help many of the younger children carrying their luggage to the station. But at 9:40 a.m, that whole college contingent, 393 people, boarded the train from that station. And officially, nobody knew where the college was going. Nobody was told. But unfortunately, there was an unhelpful leak to one member of staff. And so we know that at least those in charge and the staff knew that the destination was going to be to Reigate in Surrey. And on arrival in Reigate, again, our history books tell us that 400 bodies clambered on board a number of buses and were transported to a variety of distribution points where they were offered sweet tea and sticky biscuits. So from then on from the arrival of Reigate began a 6-year period of really considerable challenge. There was no central location for the school. It wasn't like they went from St Dunstan's College to another school. It involved sharing facilities with other schools, particularly Reigate Grammar School, which was very challenging, very difficult to negotiate and make best use of. And so in large part, they had to make use of large houses in the local area and the kindness of local people. And I know, for example, that chemistry lessons were undertaken in somebody's bedroom. They'd reconverted it into a chemistry lab, and all sorts of compromises had to be made, and people had to rely on the generosity of local people. Many of the pupils actually continued to commute either every day into London or Kent, or at least at the weekends to go back home and then out during the week to their home in the Surrey countryside. And in fact, one pupil, it's reported, cycled every single day from Catford to Reigate, even in the depths of winter, which is extraordinary. So there were significant challenges, in particular finding the children accommodation. As I say, they didn't just go to another boarding school, they had to be accommodated by local people. And some, of course, were very fortunate to have found themselves living with some really kind people, and others were much less fortunate. And in fact, one boy had 14 different families to live with over 6 years. Can you imagine having to build those relationships and every time move to a different family? It would have been very, very difficult. And then, of course, there was the constant anxiety of what might have happened to friends and to family and to loved ones, either who were fighting on the front or those who were remaining in London through times of bombing. And even in Reigate, the air raid stations were being used constantly, a really terrifying time. There was also the sound of the Red Cross trains charging through the countryside back with the injured and dying from the front, and that would have left a terrible mark on the children who heard it. And of course, the whirring overhead of the fighter planes would have been both exhilarating on the one hand, but also utterly terrifying for the children. So an extraordinary time. Eventually, in 1944, everything became so challenging that actually they took the decision to evacuate the school again, this time to North Wales. I wasn't so clear on this bit of our history before I'd read it. And this was an even more different setting, really different, going up to North Wales. And indeed, initially, the children had to stay in an American army camp until their accommodation was sorted for a few days. And that was apparently an experience in its own right, I'm sure. And eventually, they stayed in a range of across the Welsh valleys and villages. And it was really hard, a very, very different environment. If you imagine 1940s Welsh mining villages with a load of London children staying in them, very, very difficult indeed. Apparently there was some good that came out of it, and I read that at least one St Dunstan's boy ended up marrying one of the Welsh girls. But the environment in Wales, it was so dispersed, it was very, very difficult for any sense of sort of discipline or order to be maintained. The headmaster was there, but very difficult for him, Headmaster Hecker, to maintain it. And again, if you look in the history books, it states that he decided that things were so out of control. I suspect also they'd been relocated for the best part of 6 years. I think they were probably, going, allowing the euphoria of it or the pressure of it to go to their heads. But anyway, the head master at the time decided to devolve discipline down to the prefects who lived with the younger students or close to them, and also to allow corporal punishment again. So apparently almost at once all the prefects went out to the local churchyards, took willow sticks off the trees, and used them to whack any child or boy, as it was then, whenever it was necessary. So but don't get any ideas, new prefect team, please. So those times in Wales were really challenging for the children, staying all that way in a very, very different environment. But of course, there was a great joy too, and there are reports of the wonderful countryside that we know, many of us know, still exists today in that part of Wales, and the likes of which for the children of London, many of them had never seen countryside like it, and as well some wonderful hospitality from fantastic Welsh families who were looking after the children there as well. So what does all this say to me? Well, 75 years ago today for St Dunstan's ended a hugely challenging period in our history. A challenge arguably for St Dunstan's, the likes of which has not been seen until today in our current relocation situation. But today, like then, we can of course see the compassion and the courage of our St Dunstan's community in abundance. And so as we go into this 3-day bank holiday weekend, we, of course, should and must remember the tremendous sacrifice of the world as it fought and overcame that great evil in the Second World War. And we remember the many lives of Dunstonians in particular that were given to fight those battles. But let us also remember the courage of those children who were left behind, who were plunged into those unknown circumstances, those challenging circumstances, and the teachers as well, and the unfamiliar environments. And remember that all of those people came out the other side and returned once again to St Dunstan's, as we will too. Have a very nice long weekend.
VE Day, a poem by Patricia Denise Newman. It's over. It's finished. The war has now been won. Thank God it's finally ended. Finished. Over. Done. We'll no longer hear the sirens as the bombs come falling down. No longer hear the aircraft as they fly above the town. No longer see the searchlights lighting up the darkened sky, or see the burning buildings of the terraces nearby. We can hear the people cheering as the bells peal out the news, and we gather dancing in the road, dispelling wartime blues. It's victory in Europe. Oh, such a lovely sound. No bombs, no incendiary fires, no more sleeping underground. The roads are filled with happy people, celebrating victory. The lights are on in every town, such a brilliant sight to see. There's bonfires and fireworks, a colourful display. We'll sing and dance and drink with cheer until night turns to day. We'll not forget the sacrifices made by others in our name. They gave their lives so we might live in freedom's sweet domain. Their fighting now is ended. Rejoice in victory. England and her allies will remain forever free.
Hello everyone, it's really nice to be talking to you. I've missed you all terribly, and looking forward so much to the day when we should all be together again as a school community. I'm going to speak about VE Day. VE Day is the victory in Europe, the day when the war in Europe ended, the Second World War. I've been watching some old newsreels of that time. Of course, it's 75 years ago. Some grainy black and white newsreels. But they tell us so much of the anticipation and excitement of the time. Remember, people have been through years of war with all the heartache and pain and suffering that brings to a nation and to individuals. And now rumours began to go round that the war was ending, and people began to gather on the streets in anticipation. And then Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister at the time, announced that the war had ended. What an incredible moment for excitement. People had seen cameras arriving at Buckingham Palace and knew that something exciting was about to be announced. And they started to party in the streets. Parties broke out all over the place. People were dancing in Trafalgar Square, and some jumping into the fountains in the pleasure and excitement that the war had ended. A huge crowd gathered at the palace, and the king and the queen and the princesses, including our own queen, came onto the balcony, and there was such fun and excitement and joy at the thought of the end of the war. Millions of people taking to the streets. Imagine the relief after so much that had been so difficult and painful in their lives. Themselves and their family members serving in the armed forces overseas, the anxiety and worry about their safety and would they return. The Blitz, when so much of London were bombed, people gathering in railway tube stations and little huts in their gardens to protect themselves. The injuries to people who came home, both physical and mental. The loss of loved ones who would never come home. All this was a price that was paid. But now they were celebrating. They were dancing in the streets. They were full of the joy that such things were now over. Mr. Hewlett told us in his Monday reflection that St Dunstan's as a school was moved into Surrey, into Reigate, in order, of course, to get away from the bombing and the danger that was always present in London and in, of course, many other great cities and towns in our nation. And so they would have gone down to Reigate and they would have kept the school going there. Whilst they were there, our school, of course, was not empty. It was taken over by the army, and they requisitioned it and used it as part of their headquarters locally. Mr. Hewlett reminded us that when the teachers and pupils returned to Catford, the school was in a terrible state. Lots of mess all over the place and things thrown about. Huge coal tips in the sports grounds. And the staff and the students set forth in order to clear up and make new again their own school so that they could begin to live their lives as they once had, as a school community back in their home. And of course, we're not at school at the moment. It's mainly empty. There are some people, of course, who are looking after some children whose parents are key workers, and others have to be there. But for most of us, we are at home. This is a very strange way of living, and it's not natural to us not to be socializing and being together. And so one might say another war is being fought, a war against this awful virus. Our scientists and our doctors and others are working tirelessly, fighting against this virus, trying to find medication perhaps in order to treat those who have the illness and Above all, of course, a vaccine, which will protect us all from it and will be the beginning of, or perhaps much nearer the end of, this strange way of living and a return to normality. We're all missing school. We're all, I'm sure, missing our friends, our teachers. To kick about on a lovely day like this with a football at lunchtime, singing in the choir, or just sitting around talking to each other, telling our story and listening to others. This is the natural way of being a human being. It's to socialise. It's to be together. Much of what enabled the soldiers in both world wars, but today we think of the Second World War, much of what enabled them to survive was the comradeship, the friendships. They looked after each other and cared for each other. They felt part of a community, and that is true as well of our school. We must believe that the virus will be beaten, and albeit our return to what we call normality might be rather slow, it will happen. We shall get there. People shall stop becoming ill, and we shall return to our lives, which we so miss. Of course, being in this rather strange situation has taught us some things which are good. I think perhaps we should always now value each other a little more, now that we've experienced what it's like not to have each other. And perhaps valuing family, friends, neighbours, school, communities and others will enable us to have a good sense of proportion about what really matters. Also, we shall value the freedoms we enjoy. We're not used to a government telling us we can't go out, or if we do go out, it's for an hour. We can't have parties, we can't have friends round, we can't visit family. This is not our way of life, and so we will value perhaps more that freedom which we live under. And also, we shall never take for granted, will we, those who have worked in the health service, those who have risked their own lives in order to care for others and to try to heal them. We shall always now have a special place in our hearts for them, and for those who have worked in schools looking after children of key workers, those in nursing homes, hospices, and those going into people's own homes who need care. I hope we shall value them more and think of the enormous sacrifice and courage they've had. As we think of war, of course, we think of courage in a different way. But courage comes to us in many ways, and some of them are not dramatic. That they're going into a home to wash and to dress and to care and to feed someone who is helpless and who needs to be cared for. And so let us be thankful for all those who've maintained our freedom in the Second World War, who fought so that we could live as we do once we're through this pandemic. Let us think of the members of our school who were part of that, and we also think of those who gave their lives for those freedoms. We will be together again. It will happen. We shall celebrate. We shall dance. I hope not too many of you will jump into fountains. If you do, make sure they're shallow. We shall laugh. We shall have parties. We shall hear corks popping. We shall thank God, I hope, and celebrate each other. We are deeply grateful to all who were part of that process of allowing us as a nation to defeat evil and to become free, and to free others all over the world who were oppressed. And it is in that light that we look forward to the day when we too can return to our school community. What a day that will be for rejoicing. God bless you all.
I went to see a bonfire one V-night on the hill. The searchlights all were glowing, and all was bright and still. Then someone raised a mighty shout. Throw on some wood, they said. Let's go and bring the people out to see the embers red. Let's let off lots of fireworks, some yellow, green and blue, some Catherine wheels and rockets, and rain of every hue. The people sang, the people danced, they threw wood on the fire, and many children saw entranced that scene their hearts desire. For some had never seen before a fire so big as that, while fireworks and searchlights they made a Union Jack. And when at 4 o'clock next morn the crowd went down the hill, the dawn was breaking far away, that memory lingered still.
In my religion, it is a sin to dance, but I don't think God minded that today. I joined a conga line that wound its way around town. Today, May 8th, 1945, the war with Germany ended with celebration. Parades, hugs and kisses, banging pots and pans, horns tooting, confetti throwing, dancing and praying. All signs to thank the Lord that our boys in Europe are coming home. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Lord.
Diary entry by George Shaker. The sight that met our eyes was frightening. After more than 4 long years as prisoners of war, to be freed and to be set down in a few short days in London on VE Day was an experience that left us wide-eyed in astonishment. The whole population of London was stark raving mad with happiness. Men and women were hugging and kissing everyone within reach. Every statue, every lamppost, every window was draped with people screaming and shouting. Every bell from every steeple was ringing. The bedlam was a joyous sound like nothing we had ever heard. Being isolated from the free world for so long, what changes had taken place? What had happened to our friends and relatives? What are they like now? What should we do? In our state of mind, the thought of going home immediately was too terrifying to consider, and so a few friends and I decided to skip camp and head for London to see it in all its glory with lights ablazing. We arrived in London on the morning of VE Day with no place to stay and not knowing where to go. We were eventually directed to a hotel frequented by naval personnel, and after informing the manager from where we had come, he immediately found accommodation for us. After settling in our rooms, my friends and I headed for the streets of London, the most glorious celebration of all time.